She looked me straight in the eye and called me a parasite. Her exact words were, "You don't deserve that apartment. Your sister needs it more." I stood there frozen, because this wasn't some casual remark in the heat of an argument. This was my own mother telling me I was less than my pregnant sister, that everything I'd worked for could be stripped away simply because someone else needed it more. And what made it worse? The apartment wasn't hers to give. It was mine, paid for with years of my savings and sacrifices. But in that moment, she acted like my existence was secondary, like my stability, my future, my very dignity could be tossed aside. That was the day I realized this wasn't just about family favoritism. This was about power, control, and the lengths my mother would go to keep me in the role she had always written for me, the disposable daughter. What she didn't know was that I wasn't going to play along anymore. Growing up, I always knew my sister was the golden child, and I was the one who had to make do with the leftovers. But I never thought it would reach the point where my own home would be ripped out from under me in the name of her happiness. Ever since we were little, my mom made it clear who was destined for the spotlight. My sister was the delicate one, the one who had to be protected, shielded, and spoiled because she was fragile. I, on the other hand, was the strong one, the one who could survive without help, the one who supposedly didn't need attention or affection because I would figure it out. And every time I did figure it out, by studying harder, by working 2 jobs, by saving every penny, I was told it was expected of me. Nothing special, nothing worth praising. When my sister got pregnant, it was as if the world had to stop spinning to revolve around her. Suddenly, her bad choices, her careless spending, her lack of planning became my responsibility. "She's carrying life, you should support her," my mom said, as if my sister hadn't spent years blowing through her paycheck on shopping sprees and then calling me at midnight to borrow money for rent. I had quietly helped too many times, thinking it would eventually be enough for my mom to see my worth, to finally say she was proud of me. But instead, all it did was cement the idea that I was the family safety net, the one who could always be robbed to cushion my sister's falls. So when my mom stood in my living room and told me I was selfish for not handing over the keys, when she called me a parasite in my own home, it broke something deep inside me. A parasite doesn't build, doesn't sacrifice, doesn't bleed for years just to create stability. A parasite doesn't pay deposits, sign contracts, and work overtime shifts so someone else can feel safe. That was me, and she threw it back in my face as if I had stolen it from her. I wanted to scream, to tell her everything I had swallowed down for decades. But instead, I stood in silence and let her words echo in the air. Because I knew if I opened my mouth in that moment, I would never forgive myself for what I might say. Inside, though, a quiet resolve was building, a fire I had never let myself feel before. She thought I would roll over again, that I would surrender my home like I had surrendered my boundaries so many times before. But this time was different. This time I had receipts. I had legal proof, and most importantly, I had finally reached the point where I valued my own survival more than their approval. I remember the exact day I signed the papers for that apartment, because it felt like I was finally stepping out of the shadow they had kept me in my whole life. I was 25, exhausted from juggling shifts at 2 different jobs, eating ramen for weeks just to save a few extra dollars. But when I held those keys in my hand, it was the first time I felt like I had built something that belonged entirely to me. No one could take it. No one could claim it was gifted or handed down. It was mine, brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck. And yet, years later, my mom stood in that same apartment with the same entitled look on her face, declaring it was better suited for my sister, who hadn't saved a dime in her life. What burned me wasn't just the audacity, it was the way she said it, like she was making a charitable donation on my behalf, as if my hard work was some family asset she could redistribute at will. My sister, of course, stood beside her with that smug little half-smile, the one that told me she already knew this would happen, that she had been assured behind my back that her comfort would always outweigh my rights. And when I dared to remind them that I was the one on the lease, that the bills came out of my bank account every single month, My mom waved her hand like I was being dramatic. "Don't be selfish. She's pregnant. She needs stability," she said, as if pregnancy automatically rewrote property law, as if motherhood was an eraser that could wipe out every sacrifice I had ever made. For years, I had stayed quiet during the small betrayals, the times she borrowed money and never paid it back, the holidays where gifts for me were an afterthought compared to the extravagance showered on her, the family gatherings where my accomplishments were brushed aside while her smallest achievements were celebrated like miracles. I had learned to swallow the bitterness, to tell myself it wasn't worth the fight, that I was strong enough to endure it. But watching my mother and sister treat the apartment I bled for as if it were theirs to claim was different. This wasn't just favoritism. This was theft, wrapped in the language of family obligation. And for the first time, I wasn't going to let it slide. My mom underestimated me because I wasn't yelling, because I wasn't crying or pleading. She thought silence meant surrender. What she didn't realize was that silence was me sharpening my resolve, choosing my moment carefully. I had already gathered every document, every bank statement, every signed lease. I had been preparing for a day like this without even knowing it, filing away every scrap of proof while they assumed I would forever be the quiet daughter who bent instead of breaking. But this was the moment I decided I would not bend anymore. If they wanted to call me a parasite, then I would show them what survival really looked like. If they wanted to treat my independence like charity, then I would make sure the law reminded them whose name was on the dotted line. They could guilt me, they could smear me to relatives, they could scream about loyalty and family, but when the eviction notice landed in their laps, it wouldn't be me scrambling to find shelter. It would be them. The weeks that followed were some of the most surreal of my life because instead of backing down, my mother doubled down. She started calling relatives, spinning her version of the story before I even had a chance to breathe. According to her, I was a heartless, cold woman who cared more about square footage than about family. She painted me as greedy, selfish, incapable of empathy, while my sister, glowing and pregnant, was the tragic victim of my cruelty. I would get texts from cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, telling me I should be ashamed of myself, that a baby needs a home more than you do, as if I wasn't a human being with a right to the roof over my own head. The smear campaign was relentless, and for a moment it worked. I felt myself shrinking under the weight of all those voices, all those accusations, the echoes of the narrative my mother had been building about me since childhood, that I was too strong, too cold, too independent, and therefore undeserving of compassion. But then I opened the folder I had been keeping quietly in my desk drawer. Inside were copies of every lease agreement, every utility bill in my name, every payment receipt with a timestamp. Line after line of proof that I wasn't some parasite leeching off generosity. I was the one carrying the financial load while my sister floated through life on excuses. I decided then that I wouldn't fight their gossip with gossip. I would fight it with undeniable evidence. So when my mother and sister tried to march into my apartment a second time, demanding that I start packing my things so my sister could move in before the baby came, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply pulled out the folder and laid the papers on the table between us. "This is mine," I said, my voice steady. "You don't get to give it away." My sister scoffed. My mom narrowed her eyes, and I could see the moment they realized I wasn't bluffing. But instead of backing off, my mom hissed, "You wouldn't dare take this outside the family." That was her biggest mistake, assuming that I still cared more about protecting her image than about protecting myself. Within 24 hours, I had spoken to my lawyer. I filed a no trespass order, officially restricting both of them from setting foot in my home without my permission. When the paperwork was served, my mom called me in a rage, shrieking about betrayal, about how I was destroying the family, about how I would regret this when I was old and alone. I listened in silence, letting her words crash and burn against the wall I had finally built. And when she ran out of breath, I simply said, "You called me a parasite. Parasites don't provide homes. They take them. And you've been trying to take mine for years. Not anymore." That was the day the dynamic shifted forever. And for once, I was the one holding the power they thought I would never claim. After the no trespass order, the silence in my apartment felt heavier than ever. But it was also liberating, like breathing clean air after years of smoke. Still, I knew my mother wasn't done. She thrived on control, and losing her grip on me was like losing oxygen. Sure enough, the next wave came quickly, this time in the form of legal threats. She tried to twist the story into one of financial support, claiming she had contributed to my apartment over the years and therefore had some right to decide what happened with it. The irony nearly made me laugh, because every scrap of money that had ever crossed from her hand to mine had been a loan I had repaid with interest, documented down to the penny. I had bank transfers, texts, even screenshots of her demanding repayment for a $200 favor she gave me 5 years ago. It was insulting that she thought she could rewrite history, but I was ready. My lawyer and I compiled everything, and when her attorney reached out, I sent over a neatly organized packet of receipts, timestamps, and proof of repayment. I never heard back from him again. My mother, though, wasn't ready to let it go. She called relatives again, this time with even wilder stories, that I had manipulated her, that I had stolen money from her account, that I had bullied my sister during her pregnancy. The calls and texts poured in, some filled with pity, others dripping with venom. But instead of breaking me, each one reminded me that I was finally free from the obligation to explain myself to people who had only ever seen me through her distorted lens. I stopped responding. I blocked numbers. I focused on my work, on building the kind of stability they had mocked me for chasing. Then, one evening, I got a knock at my door. It was my sister, alone, her face pale and eyes swollen from crying. For the first time, she didn't look smug, she looked terrified. She confessed that Mom had promised her everything, had sworn that the apartment would be hers, had convinced her that I would fold like I always had. Now, with the baby due in weeks, she was realizing there was no backup plan. Mom hadn't saved money for her, hadn't lined up housing, hadn't done anything except push her into leaning on me. And when I refused, my sister was left stranded. She begged me to let her stay, even just temporarily, her voice breaking. And I felt the pull, the old instinct to sacrifice myself, to step in where my mother had failed. But as I looked at her, I remembered every sleepless night I had spent scraping by, every humiliation of being called unworthy, every moment I was expected to carry someone else's weight while no one even acknowledged my own. My heart ached for her, but my resolve didn't waver. "You need to figure this out," I told her gently but firmly, "because this apartment is mine, and I'm not giving it up." For the first time in my life, I chose me. My sister left that night in tears. And I won't lie, it haunted me. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had gone too far, if maybe I was becoming the heartless person my mother painted me to be. But the more I replayed it, the clearer it became. Compassion doesn't mean setting yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. For decades, I had been the safety net, the convenient option, the one expected to erase the consequences of everyone else's mistakes. And where had that gotten me? Labeled a parasite in my own home. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a string of furious texts from my mother. Apparently, my sister had gone back to her and confessed everything, and now my mother was livid that I had humiliated her by refusing to play along. She accused me of destroying the family, of abandoning my sister in her hour of need, of being poisoned by selfishness. Her words were sharp, but something had shifted inside me. I no longer felt the urge to defend myself. Instead, I screenshotted every message and filed them away. My lawyer advised me to keep everything documented in case they tried to escalate. And sure enough, they did. 2 weeks later, I got a notice in the mail. My mother had filed a claim in small claims court, arguing she had equitable interest in my apartment because of supposed contributions. I almost laughed out loud when I read it. The arrogance was staggering. But walking into that courtroom, folder in hand, I wasn't laughing. I was calm, collected, and prepared. I laid out every receipt, every bank transfer, every text. I explained how I had paid for the deposit, the rent, the utilities, everything. My mother sputtered, contradicted herself, grew flustered when the judge asked for concrete proof of her claims. At one point, she even said, "Well, she's my daughter, so of course I should have a say." And I saw the judge's eyebrow arch in disbelief. When the ruling came, it was swift and decisive. The apartment was mine, solely and unquestionably. My mother's claim was dismissed with prejudice. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt taller, lighter, freer. It wasn't just a legal win. It was the first time an authority figure had looked at my situation and affirmed what I had always known. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't selfish. I wasn't a parasite. I was someone who had built her own life despite every obstacle. My mother's face as we left said everything: rage, shock, and for the first time, maybe a flicker of fear. She had lost control, and she knew it. After the court ruling, the silence from my mother was deafening, but it didn't last long. She had lost legally, so she turned to the only weapon she had left: social warfare. She called family friends, church acquaintances, even distant relatives overseas, weaving a story about how I had humiliated her in public and torn apart the family for money. The funny part was, for the first time, some people didn't believe her. A cousin reached out privately and said, "You know, I always wondered how you managed to stay afloat while your sister was always asking for help. I think you did the right thing." It was a small message, but it meant everything. The cracks in her perfect facade were finally showing. Meanwhile, my sister stopped calling. I heard through the grapevine that she had moved in temporarily with one of our aunts, and that the situation was tense. Without my apartment as her safety net, reality had hit hard. She was scrambling for childcare plans, scrambling for stability, and apparently realizing that our mother's promises meant nothing. And though part of me pitied her, another part of me knew this was the lesson she had avoided all her life, that depending on Mom's favoritism wasn't the same as having a foundation. While they scrambled, I started making changes of my own. I redecorated the apartment, painting the walls, hanging art, buying furniture that felt like me instead of leftovers from family hand-me-downs. It was symbolic as much as practical, a way of reclaiming the space fully, of erasing the ghosts of entitlement that had haunted it. Every brushstroke, every new piece of furniture was like a declaration: this is mine and no one can take it from me again. Of course, my mother tried one last tactic, showing up at my job. She confronted me in the parking lot, accusing me of being ungrateful, of ruining my sister's chance at a happy life. I stood there in my work clothes, holding my bag, and for the first time I didn't feel the urge to shrink. I looked her straight in the eye and said, "You don't get to decide what I owe anymore." Her face twisted in shock, because I had never spoken to her like that, never broken the script she had written for me. She muttered something about how I would regret this when I was alone and walked away. But the funny thing is, I didn't feel alone at all. For the first time in years, I felt whole, because I had chosen myself. It wasn't overnight, but slowly, life began to feel like it was mine again. Without the constant interruptions, the guilt trips, the manipulative phone calls, my apartment became a sanctuary instead of a battleground. I'd come home from work, light a candle, make myself dinner in peace, and sit in silence that felt like freedom instead of loneliness. I poured my energy into my career, took on projects I had been too drained to attempt before, and even started saving for travel, something my mother used to mock as selfish indulgence. Meanwhile, word of what had happened continued to ripple through the family. Some relatives quietly distanced themselves from my mother when they realized how far she had gone. Others stayed loyal to her narrative, but the difference now was that I didn't care. Their opinions no longer had power over me because I had tangible proof of my worth every time I walked into my own home and turned the key in the door. My sister eventually gave birth, and though I sent a small gift out of basic human decency, I kept my distance. It wasn't my responsibility to rescue her from the choices she had made under my mother's influence. And in time, I heard she had finally secured her own apartment with government assistance, a place she had to apply for and manage herself. It wasn't easy for her, but it was hers, and maybe for the first time in her life, she had to understand what it meant to stand on her own 2 feet. My mother, on the other hand, became more bitter, more isolated. The woman who once controlled every narrative now found her stories questioned, her manipulation less effective. She tried once or twice to lure me back in with guilt, calls on holidays, vague messages about how family should stick together. But I never took the bait. I had drawn my boundary in concrete, and I wasn't going to step over it again. The day I realized just how far I had come was when I passed my old bank branch where I used to beg for extensions on late payments. I remembered the version of me who thought being strong meant enduring endless exploitation. Now strength meant saying no. Strength meant choosing myself. And for the first time, I didn't just survive my family, I rose above them. Months passed, and I could feel the old version of myself fading, the one who bent over backward to prove I was worthy of scraps, the one who mistook endurance for love. I began building a new rhythm, weekend mornings at farmers' markets, evenings curled up with books I finally had time to read, the quiet joy of not waiting for the next crisis to explode. And with that peace came something unexpected. People started noticing the change in me. At work, colleagues commented that I seemed more confident, more present. A friend told me, "You look lighter, like you finally let go of something heavy." They were right. I had been carrying decades of resentment disguised as loyalty, and setting it down made me stand taller. My mother tried one last desperate tactic. She mailed me a letter. In it, she wrote pages about how I had broken her heart, how my coldness would leave me abandoned one day, how I should think of the family name before ruining our reputation further. But tucked between the guilt-laden paragraphs was a line that told me everything. "Your sister still believes the apartment should have been hers." And I agree. Even after everything, the court case, the no trespass order, the humiliation, she still couldn't admit she was wrong. She still saw me not as a person, but as an obstacle to her vision of how life should go. I folded the letter, placed it in the same folder with all the receipts and legal documents, and felt a wave of clarity. I wasn't going to answer. I wasn't going to fight. The silence I gave her was the only response she deserved. A year later, I signed the final paperwork that made the apartment officially mine, free and clear. No loans, no disputes, no shadows. Just me, the deed, and the life I had fought to protect. I stood in the middle of my living room, sunlight streaming through the windows, and whispered to myself, "This is mine. I earned it." And in that moment, I realized something bigger than revenge. I didn't need her validation. I didn't need anyone to tell me I was worthy. My existence, my effort, my survival had always been proof enough. The longer I stayed away, the clearer everything became. How much of my life had been shaped around my mother's moods, her approval, her control. For years, I thought love was measured in how much pain you were willing to tolerate, how much of yourself you were willing to sacrifice to keep the peace. I thought if I just gave a little more, she would finally see me. But the truth was, she never wanted to see me. She wanted to mold me, to use me, to keep me small enough that I would never threaten the fragile pedestal she had built for my sister. Once I broke free from that, it was like stepping into sunlight after a lifetime underground. I started therapy, and it was in those sessions that I said words I had never dared to say out loud before. My mother doesn't love me. She loves control. Saying it felt like tearing off a bandage, exposing something raw, but it was also the first step in real healing. I began to understand that I hadn't failed as a daughter. She had failed as a mother. That realization reshaped everything. Suddenly, her insults lost their sting. The word parasite became almost laughable when I thought about the countless times she drained me financially, emotionally, spiritually, just to prop up the golden child. I began to recognize patterns, not just in her, but in me. Why I had always dated men who needed saving. Why I overextended myself at work. Why I constantly felt like I had to prove I was enough. And slowly, I started unlearning those habits. I said no more often. I stopped apologizing for things that weren't my fault. I cut ties with people who only took and never gave. And with each step, I felt the grip of her influence loosen further. My sister eventually reached out months after giving birth, her voice softer than I had ever heard it. She admitted she was struggling, that Mom hadn't been there for her the way she promised, that the pedestal she was placed on felt like a prison now that she had a baby depending on her. I listened, but I didn't rush to fix things. For the first time, I let her sit with her reality. I told her I hoped she figured it out, that I wished her well, but I couldn't be her safety net anymore. She cried, not out of anger, but out of something like understanding. Maybe she finally saw what I had seen all along, that Mom's love wasn't love at all, just a tool to divide us. As for me, I kept moving forward. I took a trip to Italy, something I had dreamed about since I was a teenager, but always pushed aside because it felt too indulgent. Standing in Florence, staring at cathedrals built by hands that believed in their own vision no matter how impossible it seemed, I felt a kinship with that kind of stubborn survival. I thought about the girl who once believed she wasn't worthy of anything unless her mother approved, and I wanted to hug her, to tell her she would make it out. She would carve a life that was hers and hers alone. I came back home to my apartment with souvenirs in my bag and a fire in my chest. I started a small side business, something creative that filled me with joy instead of just paying the bills. It grew slowly, but it was mine. Every client, every dollar, every success. And every time I looked around my home, I remembered that this space, this freedom, this peace existed because I finally chose myself. My mother may never admit what she did. She may never see me beyond her narrative. But I don't need her to. The revenge wasn't in destroying her. It was in building a life she couldn't touch, in proving that I wasn't a parasite, but a survivor, a builder, a woman who turned every insult into fuel. And that's when I realized I hadn't just reclaimed my apartment. I had reclaimed myself. By the time a full year had passed since that day in court, I was no longer the same woman who stood frozen in her own living room while her mother spat the word parasite. I had grown roots in places I never thought possible, at work, where I earned a promotion because I finally had the energy to focus on my career instead of endless family drama. In my friendships, which deepened because I no longer canceled plans to deal with another crisis. Even in myself, as I discovered hobbies and joys I'd been too drained to pursue before. I started painting again, something I had given up in college because Mom said it was a waste of time. I hung my canvases around the apartment, each stroke a declaration that my life was mine to create. The colors filled the walls where her voice once echoed, and every day it reminded me that silence can be beautiful when it's yours. Of course, the family still whispered. I'd hear through secondhand channels that Mom was furious with how arrogant I'd become, that I thought I was better than everyone now. But here's the thing, those whispers no longer sent me spiraling. Instead, they sounded like confirmation that I had finally broken free from the box she tried to keep me in. My sister, meanwhile, was struggling more than she let on. She had 2 part-time jobs, a baby, and very little support, and the golden glow that once surrounded her had started to dim. Occasionally she'd reach out, not for help but for conversation, and our talks were cautious but real. For the first time, I felt like we were 2 women, not rivals in our mother's game. Sometimes she'd even apologize in small ways, not outright, but through comments like, "I wish I hadn't believed everything she said," or, "I didn't realize how much pressure she put on you too." Hearing those words didn't erase the past, but they cracked open a door I thought had been sealed forever. Meanwhile, Mom kept circling like a vulture looking for a new angle. One holiday, she sent me an invitation to a family dinner, scribbled with, "Let's put the past behind us." I almost laughed. The past wasn't something I could just fold into a napkin and toss in the trash. It was the very foundation of the boundaries I had finally built. I didn't go. Instead, I spent Christmas Eve in my apartment, wrapped in a blanket, sipping wine, and watching the lights twinkle across my street. And you know what? It was the most peaceful holiday I'd ever had. No screaming, no guilt, no fake smiles for photos. Just me, in the home I had fought for, living on my own terms. That night, it hit me. Revenge wasn't about making her suffer or proving her wrong in front of everyone. Revenge was simply thriving in a life she said I didn't deserve. It was walking into my home every night and knowing she couldn't take it. It was paying bills with my own money, traveling when I wanted, resting when I needed, and creating joy out of the very space she tried to steal. She once told me I would end up with nothing if I didn't play by her rules. But standing there in my quiet, decorated apartment, I realized I had ended up with everything that mattered: peace, independence, and the knowledge that I had survived her version of love and built something better. And that is a kind of victory she will never understand. 2 years later, I hardly recognized the woman in the mirror. My hair was longer, my posture straighter, my eyes softer. Not because life had suddenly become easy, but because I had finally learned what it meant to live without carrying the crushing weight of my mother's expectations. The apartment that once felt like a battlefield now pulsed with warmth and stability. Friends came over often, filling the space with laughter that used to feel foreign to these walls. I even hosted a small dinner party, something I never would have dared back when my mother controlled every detail of my life. As my guests left that night, one of them said, "Your home feels so alive, so you," and I nearly cried, because that was all I had ever wanted, a place that reflected who I was, not who I was forced to be. Meanwhile, my sister's life had taken a different turn. With 2 kids now, she was exhausted, constantly juggling work, childcare, and the echoes of promises our mother never delivered on. We spoke occasionally, more honestly than ever before. She admitted she resented Mom too, for setting her up to believe she'd always be rescued. "I thought I was special," she said once, her voice breaking. "But I was just being used to control you." It was a bittersweet truth, one that softened some of the anger I had carried toward her. We were both victims, just in different roles of the same cruel play. That realization didn't erase the pain, but it opened space for compassion, the kind that didn't require me to sacrifice myself again. My mother, on the other hand, was unraveling. The power she once wielded over both of us was slipping away, and she didn't know how to function without it. Relatives who once rallied behind her began to keep their distance, tired of the constant drama. The stories she spread about me grew more outrageous, and instead of painting me as the villain, they started making her look unhinged. It was the justice I never had to lift a finger for, the natural consequence of a lifetime spent manipulating others. One day, out of curiosity, I drove by her house. The yard was overgrown, the blinds drawn tight, the once bustling place now eerily silent. I didn't knock. I didn't need to. For the first time, I realized I didn't owe her closure, forgiveness, or even confrontation. My life was proof enough that I had broken free. As I drove back to my apartment, the one she tried to strip from me, I felt a wave of gratitude. Not for what she did, but for what I had built in spite of it. The revenge wasn't loud, and it wasn't dramatic. It was quiet mornings with coffee on my balcony. It was signing my name on documents that no one could contest. It was booking trips, building friendships, starting projects that fed my soul. It was every single day I got to live without her voice dictating my choices. And when I looked around at the life I had carved out of all the pain she tried to bury me under, I smiled to myself and thought, this is what survival looks like. This is what victory feels like. Tell me, do you think I went too far or not far enough? As the years stretched further, the distance between me and my mother turned from a wound into a scar, still visible, still part of me, but no longer raw. I built a new life, brick by brick, not with grand gestures, but with small, steady acts of choosing myself every single day. I went back to school part-time, something I had always wanted but never thought I could manage under her constant sabotage. Walking into those classrooms with younger students, I felt both out of place and completely at home. It was intimidating, sure, but it was also liberating to sit there with a notebook open, chasing knowledge for no one but me. And every time I submitted an assignment, I thought of how my mother used to tell me I'd never make it on my own. I smiled, because here I was, proving her wrong in silence. My sister and I grew closer in strange, halting steps. She no longer defended Mom, not after years of broken promises and empty words. She confided in me one night that Mom had even called her a burden recently, the same venom she once reserved for me. That's when it clicked. It was never about me or her, it was about control. Once I escaped, my sister became the new target. And when she couldn't keep propping up Mom's illusions, she too was discarded. We cried together over that realization, not as rivals but as survivors of the same twisted game. For the first time, our bond felt real, not orchestrated by manipulation. And while I couldn't erase the past, I could choose to move forward differently. With boundaries, yes, but also with a kind of compassion that came from understanding exactly how much we both lost. As for Mom, she became a ghost of the tyrant she once was. The more people stopped listening to her stories, the more desperate she became. She'd send letters filled with accusations one month, then pleas for forgiveness the next. At first, they rattled me, but eventually, I saw them for what they were. Flailing attempts to pull me back into a role I no longer played. I stopped opening them. They piled up in a drawer, unopened, until one day I threw them all out. That act felt like burning an old script, freeing myself from the lines she had forced me to recite my whole life. In the quiet that followed, I realized revenge wasn't a single act. It wasn't the courtroom victory or the no trespass order, or even refusing to give up the apartment. It was the accumulation of all the ways I rebuilt myself. It was choosing therapy over self-blame, choosing travel over guilt, choosing peace over chaos. It was in the laughter of friends around my dinner table, in the art I painted on my walls, in the steady beat of a life that was finally mine. And when I walked through the door each night, keys jingling in my hand, I whispered the same words to myself like a prayer, like a victory chant, like a promise kept. This is mine. I am mine. 5 years after that day, my mother spat the word parasite at me. I woke up one morning and realized my entire world had shifted so far from hers, it almost felt like a different lifetime. My apartment, once a battlefield of guilt and entitlement, had become a foundation for everything new I built. The walls that echoed with fights now echoed with music, with conversations, with the sound of me living on my own terms. I had finished my degree, launched my side business into a full-time career, and even bought a small studio space across town where I painted and hosted workshops. People came not just to learn, but to connect, and for the first time, I felt like I was giving from abundance rather than depletion. The irony wasn't lost on me. My mother once told me I'd never amount to anything without her guidance, yet it was her absence that allowed me to bloom. My sister, meanwhile, had grown too. She had 2 kids now, both rambunctious and sweet, and though her life was still chaotic, she was finally standing on her own. Sometimes we'd meet at a cafe halfway between our homes, and the conversations were nothing like they used to be. She no longer compared, no longer carried that smug superiority. Instead, she often looked tired but honest, sometimes even apologetic. "I used to think Mom loved me more," she admitted once, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. "But I see now, she just used me differently." That sentence broke something in me and healed something at the same time. It wasn't vindication, not exactly, but it was recognition. We had both been pawns, but now we were learning to step off the board. As for Mom, her world shrank with every year. The family network she once manipulated began to crumble. Relatives stopped answering her calls, neighbors stopped entertaining her stories, and eventually, she was left with only her bitterness for company. Occasionally, I'd hear updates through others, that she was sick, that she was struggling financially, that she was angry no one rushed to her aid the way she had always expected. There was a time when that news would have pulled me back, would have made me question if I was being too cruel, too distant. But not anymore. I had learned that rushing in to save her wasn't kindness, it was erasure of myself. And I had already erased myself once. I wasn't going to do it again. The true revenge was never about seeing her punished or watching her fall apart. The true revenge was in every sunrise I woke up to without dread, in every dollar I earned that no one could claim, in every memory I created that wasn't tainted by her control. It was in the life I carved from the ashes she tried to bury me under. There were nights I'd sit on my balcony with a glass of wine, watching the city lights stretch out before me, and think about that girl I used to be. The one who thought silence would keep the peace. Who thought being strong meant carrying everyone else's weight. I wanted to reach back in time, wrap my arms around her and whisper, "You will survive this. You will thrive. You will build something so beautiful they can't touch it." I started dating again too, slowly and carefully. I no longer chose men who needed fixing, who echoed my mother's demands in a different form. I chose partners who respected my space, who saw me as whole rather than a resource. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of being too much or too cold. I realized that the right people don't punish you for boundaries. They respect them. That lesson was worth every scar, every courtroom battle, every sleepless night spent wondering if I was cruel for saying no. And so the woman my mother once called a parasite became the woman who owned her home, her business, her peace. Not because it was handed to me, not because anyone saved me, but because I saved myself. And maybe that's the kind of victory my mother will never understand. That I didn't need her approval to matter, and I never will again. It's strange how life has a way of circling back, giving you moments you never asked for but needed in order to close a chapter. Nearly a decade after the day my mother tried to strip me of my home, I got a call from a relative I barely kept in touch with. The news was simple. My mother was in a hospital, frail, bitter, and alone. For a brief second, I felt that old reflex, the instinct to drop everything, to rush to her side, to save her from the consequences of her own choices. But it passed almost as quickly as it came, replaced by a calm clarity I had earned through years of healing. I didn't go. I didn't need to. She had made her choices just as I had made mine. The woman who once stood in my apartment calling me a parasite had hollowed out her own life with manipulation and control until there was nothing left but the echo of her own voice. Meanwhile, my life was fuller than I ever imagined it could be. My business had grown to the point where I hired 2 employees, young women who reminded me of myself at their age, hungry for independence, desperate to prove themselves, terrified of being small. I mentored them not as someone trying to control, but as someone determined to give them the tools to stand tall on their own. Every time I saw their confidence grow, I thought, this is the cycle breaking. This is what it looks like when pain becomes purpose. My sister and I found a new rhythm, too. We weren't best friends, not the way some siblings are, but there was a respect between us that had never existed before. She stopped asking me to save her, and in that space we found something healthier. Conversations about our kids, our jobs, our dreams. Yes, she had kids, and though I never imagined myself as the kind of aunt who would be present, I found joy in their laughter, in their wide-eyed wonder, in the chance to be a safe place for them in ways I never had. There were times when I would catch myself thinking about what might have been if things had been different. If my mother had chosen to love instead of control, if my sister and I had been united instead of divided from the start. But then I'd look around at my life, the home that pulsed with my spirit, the work that filled me with pride, the relationships I chose intentionally instead of out of obligation, and I realized I wouldn't trade it. Not because the pain was fair or justified, but because I had turned it into something she could never take credit for. She tried to break me, and instead, she built me. The final act of revenge wasn't in the courtroom, or in the silence I gave her letters, or even in refusing to give up my apartment. The final act of revenge was in living a life so whole, so untouchable, that her words no longer had weight. A parasite doesn't create, doesn't nurture, doesn't thrive. But I did. I became the opposite of what she said I was. I became the proof that survival isn't just about existing. It's about building, about flourishing, about choosing yourself over and over again until it becomes second nature. So now, when I turn the key in my door each night, I smile. Not just because the apartment is mine, but because everything it represents is mine. The boundaries, the healing, the independence, the peace. My mother's voice is gone from these walls, and in its place is my own, steady and sure. The girl who once thought she had to earn love by giving everything away is gone too. In her place is a woman who knows her worth. Who knows that the most powerful revenge isn't destruction? It's living so fully that the people who tried to bury you can't stand to look. And sometimes, when the city is quiet and the lights from the street spill into my window, I whisper the same words that carried me through it all. The same words that once felt defiant, but now feel like truth. This is mine. I am mine,